Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming along. We should get started. We're past 2 o'clock now. Welcome to this afternoon session entitled Heritage in Peril. My name is Dr. Alex Bremner, Gates Scholar 2001, and I'll be your host and moderator for this afternoon's session. Now, just to remind ourselves why we're here and what we're supposed to be talking about, I'll simply read the very brief abstract that accompanied this session when it was first mooted, and it says here that, and I quote, "Many are calling the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, in other words ISIS, its destruction of some of mankind's most important ancient monuments in what is widely regarded as the cradle of civilization to be the worst cultural heritage emergency since World War II. The destruction of the Greco-Roman city of Palmyra is just one of dozens of culturally significant sites to be devastated by ISIS, either through directed culture-killing tactics or demolitions to clear strategic routes. Some cultural preservationists, including those at UNESCO and the Institute of Digital Archaeology based in Oxford, are using technology like 3D printing and digital mapping cameras to preserve a highly detailed record of what was there when protecting sites on the ground when that proves too dangerous. This roundtable discussion delves into the departure from traditional heritage preservation and the technical, ethical and diplomatic challenges that come with rethinking World Heritage preservation. So there you have it. Now the way I'd like to run this panel this afternoon, I mean originally it was presented as a roundtable discussion where it was supposed to be just us four speakers talking amongst ourselves while you passively watched us do that like we were so many animals in a zoo or something like that. But instead of that format, I think a better, more conducive one to engagement and dialogue would be for us to act as a sort of traditional panel where I will address a series of questions touching on some of the key issues around this topic to the panel members. We will have a kind of dialogue, discussion about this. And after a certain period of time, I will open up this discussion to you as the audience, as you may have your own views on this, you may have questions or comments and the like. And I think that, again, will be more conducive to a proper dialogue on this subject. So that's how I intend to run it. What I'll do now is introduce our panel. So to my immediate left here is Tala Jajour. Tala likes to think about how and why people make music. Her research focuses on musical cultures of the Middle East and is guided by an interest in intersections between religion and popular culture. Currently, she is focusing on mode, emotion, value, and aesthetics. She will be in Germany next year as excellent junior researcher at the University of Tübingen. As a Gates Scholar and PhD student at Cambridge, she worked on the Christian migrant community who fled southeastern Turkey in the aftermath of World War I. Her monograph on the Syriac chant of Edessa in modern-day Aleppo is under contract with Oxford University Press, and we look forward to seeing that when it appears. Next here is Marie-Louise Sorensen. She is Professor of European Prehistory and Heritage Studies here at the University of Cambridge. She coordinates heritage research and teaching within the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology and has done that since 1990. And has worked extensively with the reconstruction of cultural heritage after war, with particular attention towards the impact on identity and group cohesion. The focus of the group she coordinates has been Europe over the last 200 years, and whether we can draw out lessons from past conflicts. Indeed, one of her recently co-edited volumes captures some of the issues arising from the case studies researched by this group and is entitled War and Cultural Heritage, Biographies of Place, published by CUP in 2015. And on the end here we have Max Sternberg, who is lecturer in the Department of Architecture here at the University of Cambridge and Deputy Director of the Centre for Urban Conflicts Research. He works on the politics of heritage in contested cities and the reception of the Middle Ages in modern architecture. Among his recent publications include The Struggle for Jerusalem's Holy Places and Cistercian Architecture and Medieval Society, both published in 2013. And just for your own information regarding me, I am Senior Lecturer in Architectural History at the University of Edinburgh. My research focuses on the history and culture of the Victorian period, with a special interest in the art, architecture and urbanism of that period, and in particular the British Empire. My recent publications include Imperial Gothic, Religious Architecture and High Anglican Culture in the British Empire, published by Yale University Press in 2013, and Making History, Edward Augustus Freeman and Victorian Cultural Politics, published by the British Academy and OUP in 2015. So, and also, as you can see, I'm probably the least qualified person on this panel to be speaking to the subject today, but rest assured we will have a good discussion about this. Now, I'll just launch straight into it. So as I said, what I intend to do here is to just get the discussion rolling by asking a few initial questions to the panel concerning some of the key issues concerning this subject. So perhaps the first and most fundamental question here might be exactly what is heritage, and how ought we to define what heritage is for the purposes of this discussion today? Because, you know, of course, heritage can operate at many different levels. It can operate at the level of the individual, of the familial, of the communal, all the way up to the national and international. I don't think any of this can be sort of taken for granted, so perhaps we need to first of all define what we are talking about here. So, panel, what can we say about what heritage is and how we ought to define it for the purposes of this discussion? Anyone can start, by the way.
Okay. Then I want to start by saying that within heritage literature, this has been discussed very much, and we actually have a slight contradiction between the understanding of what heritage is as exercised by Can you all hear me? Mm-hmm. Yeah. As exercised by institutions such as UNESCO or English Heritage or Historic England, those kind of institutions which have a very tangible focus or have had a very tangible focus, where in the study of heritage there has been a very strong tradition of seeing heritage actually as process, as social processes which create values and connections and relationships. And those two areas of thinking to some extent being connected in UNESCO creating both tangible and intangible heritage, but it is still a different way of discussing. So I actually think that there is not a very easy or straightforward answer to the question. And in terms of perils, if you think there is a clear and easy way of defining heritage, I think that's where we get into trouble.
Yeah. Tara, perhaps I can turn to you now. Mary Louise touched on this idea of the intangible heritage. Do you want to tell us a bit more about what you study in particular and how that might also play into this idea of heritage, or make us think a bit harder about what heritage actually is and means?
Right, sure. So what I do is exactly what UNESCO then decided to call intangible, because it was even harder to measure or to find or even to see. So if I had, for instance, decided to use visuals today, I would probably have shown you pictures from a city like Aleppo before the war and after the war, and I'm betting if I asked for a show of hand, many of you will have seen something pop up on your Facebook feed or a similar platform. So when we have buildings and they're destroyed, we can compare between at least what was before a certain event and after. But when we're talking about music or about oral tradition or about customs and other forms of performance that are passed down through practice, it's harder to know exactly what they sounded like and what they are like now in terms of comparison. So the intangibility of heritage is the bit that I think my work potentially brings to this panel. So there's a whole other set of challenges there. I'll just stop here for now.
Okay. Max, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I think picking up on this, well, how do we think of heritage in this particular context? What's an appropriate way of thinking about heritage? I think we could think about the changing nature of conflict. I mean, if peril is to do with conflict, war, armed struggle, violence, we need to think about the evolving nature of conflict. And I think this can be illustrated if we compare a city like Aleppo with, say, Warsaw after the Second World War. Warsaw is a very famous example of a city that was flattened, several times. Initially in '39, the German invasion, then there was the 43 ghetto rising, there was 44 Polish nationalist rising, and then as a punitive measure, the Germans decided to completely destroy the city as they withdrew from Warsaw. So it's an herbicide at a probably unprecedented scale, and probably since never quite repeated on that level. And then the decision was made, post-war, to completely reconstruct, or as much as possible, the old city, based on Venetian paintings of the 18th century, mainly by Canaletto and others. So it's a sort of heroic story of heritage, emergency heritage practices and so on. And it was contested because the accuracy and authenticity of the reconstruction, this peculiar sense of alienation for local residents who'd seen the city destroyed and suddenly reconstructed. And so is that still my home, and what about my own traumatic experiences? And so it's complex, but ultimately if you go to Warsaw now, you don't even realize that it was ever reconstructed or destroyed. Unless you know the history, it's become authentic by osmosis again. But that was a war where war was declared, or at least there was a very clear moment of invasion. And there was war, then there was a ceasefire, there was a surrender, and there was a treaty, a peace treaty, and a kind of an obvious post-war situation, a post-conflict situation. Whereas in Aleppo, not only is the war ongoing, but when will it ever quite end? And the nature of war is different insofar as in Poland it was clearly an external agent that came in that brought this devastation onto the country, onto the city, and then you could sort of, they left and you could reconstruct. Whereas if the destruction is brought also from within, as well as a complex sort of constellation of international actors and so on, for whom you're reconstructing, what the nature of the reconstruction is, and how we reconstruct in a situation of ongoing conflict is a much more complex, it's a different type of complexity, let's say, and I think that's something that is worth addressing as well.
And what about the sort of dimensions of the term heritage? When I think of this term, and the way I see it used most often, seems to imply a sort of collective or communal dimension mostly, as opposed to individual, even familial. People tend to talk about the heritage of peoples, of nations, of cultures, cities, and the like. And also, of course, the global dimensions. You've got UNESCO, which sees its remit as being global, as opposed to just local or even regional. So and people often talk about, this idea of heritage of humanity, of mankind, so to speak, and that it's all part of our quote-unquote collective achievement and collective identity. Am I right in thinking this? Is this the way we should be sort of thinking about it in terms of this discussion, or can we sort of move between the individual and the global so easily? Is it too problematic to do that?
I think it's always very difficult to talk about the individual, but it's not that difficult to talk about the local. So if we may have to agree that the individual exists but confuses issue very much, then maybe one of the problems we have in the Near East at present is that we mainly think about it as a global heritage. And it is indeed very much local heritage as well. So we have a huge focus on the things which we think belong to us and to humankind and mankind and the world and so on, and we pay much less attention to the things which doesn't fit into that category, but which may matter much more for local people and their abilities to function there.
Speak to that for a moment. This is incredibly interesting for me to think about, because I am from Syria, and so all of this is also talking about how I feel about things, and in addition to the
we have an individual
right specimen. So I'm just going to throw out some examples here, but before that I want to say that anything that humankind has done is very much human. It's really impossible to disconnect what people have done in various parts of the world at various points in history, because even now, as we think of today as a very globalized age, but historians are more and more talking about how global the world was in even ancient times. Think of the Mediterranean; it's an incredibly interconnected and very complex place. So much of this stuff that was happening, and we think of as localized. But we cherish now because, well, how connected is Palmyra, for instance, to modern-day Syrians? is probably as good a question as how connected is it to somebody who lives in Rome or in Athens. But to complicate it even more, I mean, as we were discussing this last night, and I mentioned to Alex a story, you know, that the temple that was blown up by ISIS in Palmyra, it's a very small building, and it didn't have much left in it, but it was a charming sort of old structure where people would think about various forms of religions that came in and out, and there's a lot of history about religion in that part of the world as well. So there was one point where when I was a violinist, we went as a quartet and played a concert in the chamber inside the wall in that temple. So when I saw it being blown up, it wasn't only this beautiful place, it wasn't only this fascinating place my parents took me to see as a child multiple times, and we did school excursions. It was a place I had played in. It was a place I interacted with. It was something I had a living experience with. And the amphitheater where you would have seen pictures of beheadings and so on, the Syrian National Symphony Orchestra played Dido and Aeneas there, right? So would you have imagined that being a part of the collective memory and history of a country, playing early English opera in an ancient? So I mean, those connections are incredible and very meaningful. And so when people are talking about these things and thinking about them, it is immensely important to remember the local connections, but it's also very useful to remember that the local connections are at the same time global as well. So I think the key word...
I don't think all the local connections are global as well. And if you look at what we are informed about a very, very selective... It's almost like Thomas Cook travels. It's like these monuments you can't visit anymore. Yeah. And if you get information from the local people, it's a lot of, in some way, banal heritage, because it doesn't register in some of World Heritage, but it's graves, it's all the things which was part of their memory just a few generations back, which are being erased as well. That's what I meant by local. And we don't pay any attention to that because it doesn't hit us. We have no connection with it in a way.
Right. Yeah.
And I think also your story demonstrates to us how heritage is actually a living phenomenon in constantly changing state of flux, evolving. It's never static, really, and I think that's a very good point to remember. Max, what do you think about this scale of the idea of heritage?
I mean, I agree. I think with both of the points, and they sort of, to some extent, coexist. And I think we need to also be critical about this notion of world heritage and sort of who. I mean, I think also as a scholar of Victorian England, I think it'd be interesting for you to reflect on that, because I think our notion of heritage and world heritage, to some extent, is greatly indebted to imperial narratives, also of stewardship. And that sort of came back in horrible ways recently when we said, oh well, a good thing that we took, that we looted all of that art, back in the 19th century, because look at the savages with their own. I mean, I don't think a lot of people bought into that, but it was certainly, that it resurfaced briefly, and then it was, quickly sort of hidden again under some screen of political correctness. But there's a real continuity that I, for example, was able to examine in the context of Jerusalem, of how people have sort of invented the notion of sacred space and religion and landscape, in the late 19th century, as archaeologists, as cartographers, as geographers, and so on, and how that eventually got taken over by particular nation states, in this case now Israel, to frame heritage in a certain kind of way, to package it in the sort of Thomas Cook way to certain audiences for particular purposes and so on, but to pursue local agendas, in the name of world heritage. And I think sometimes there really is a disconnect, and world heritage is not necessarily a benign thing. If you look at the Venice Charter of '64. They speak of local sort of use and social function, but they still sort of say, well, only insofar as it doesn't damage, the authenticity of the place, then we can take into account. And recently in UNESCO, there's a change, and there's a sense of, well, the intangible is important as a tangible, and can you really disconnect the two? But we're only now coming around to the notion of that, local people that they exist, that they have a stake in this, that the heritage doesn't really make any sense without them because they generated it, they keep it alive. And so it's kind of, world heritage is, it's still in its infancy in terms of being critical. But I don't know whether you recognize some of the debates about heritage and peril from the imperial context that you're studying.
Certainly. I think what you say is absolutely correct that as the British spread themselves throughout the world through their empire, they were coming across ancient cultures constantly, and it wasn't long before they were studying them seriously. And what sort of emerges from that is a desire to preserve and protect, but also, as you suggest, in a kind of patrimonial fashion, as if they are sort of the keepers of this ancient past. And that brings a whole lot of political and cultural baggage with it, which we still live with today. Look, take the Elgin marbles, for instance, the debate around that one set of artefacts, and there are many more like that. For instance, when the British looted the Summer Palace in China in the I think it was either 30s or 60s, around that time, they burned it to the ground, but before they did that, they took out most of all of the precious objects. Many of them ended up in the British Museum. They're still there today. And China is rightfully wanting those artefacts back because they were basically stolen from China. So yes, this legacy we still live with, and it's a live debate and problem, I think, as part of World Heritage. It's very true, but this goes to show again how heritage is in a way politics, right? We can never forget that. We'll come back to this idea of heritage and politics in a moment. But for now, I'd just like to ask, whose heritage are we talking about? And more importantly, who decides what should be counted or classed as collective human heritage?
Formally, it's only UNESCO who can do that kind of thing, and it's states parties who make a recommendation to it. So it is in the end, it's different states who decide that this part of our national heritage is world. In any formal way, in informal way, each of us can say, this is mine and it humankind, sort of kind of thing. So it's slightly peculiar. We only have that one structure for making those claims of humankind. And you also have a few of the big museums, the ones who feel vulnerable to repatriation, like British Museum, who say that they're world museums. So you have a few phenomena, but and of course UNESCO countries sign off and on and off depending on what happened otherwise in United Nations. So it's the creation or the acceptance or the discussion of what belonged to the world is have a rather shaky foundation, I think.
Actually, if I can pick up on that, this tension between this international agency and the dependency on the nation state, and that's again where the context of conflict is really critical. I think that UNESCO, they can do some really wonderful things potentially. And for example, after natural disasters, they may come in and enable certain communities to rebuild, and they document the process of rebuilding, and they're sensitive to local needs and so on, and that's wonderful. And they have, they're a sophisticated organization, they're well educated, and there's a problem with international organization of, basically the lowest common denominator, they can ultimately pass, as a consensus, but they're still, potentially powerful. But the moment you're in a situation of conflict, that dependency on the nation state becomes really critical again. So when, again, coming back to Jerusalem, it was proposed as a World Heritage Site by the Jordanians when, the Jordanians lost in 67 and Israel annexed, unilaterally East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And so basically Jordan did this to challenge Israeli sovereignty over the old city, and as a way of also mitigating, their concern with how Israel would deal with Muslim heritage and so on. So UNESCO initially was just shut out of the equation on the ground because of Israel's suspicion towards UNESCO, because they saw them as a sort of conspiracy, as a ploy of their enemies to sort of meddle in their own affairs, challenge their own stewardship. Their argument was that previously, we were also historically shut out. Jews were the ones that were disadvantaged in terms of access to holy sites. Now we have this once in a 2,000-year opportunity to safeguard our interests, but will be magnanimous and enlightened, and will also give access to Muslims and Christians and so on. That was their sort of line. And UNESCO didn't really fit easily in that. And now they've brought them in, but on very limited terms. So ultimately, all of UNESCO's critical ability to bring in international expertise, to try and address questions of conflict are highly limited, because ultimately Israel is in charge on the ground, and they'll just shut down UNESCO the moment they do something which will challenge their way of dealing with the holy sites and their political functions. But
I think it's the same place like Syria. It's very interesting because one sees something terrible happen and you think, why don't we do anything about it? And the law, we have the Hague Convention, which Britain is just about to finally sign, and it tells you it's illegal. But in a situation where so many human rights are being compromised, what does it matter that it's illegal to doing war to destroy some heritage? It have no bite there. There's nothing, and it's unclear who they have to work with in Syria. So the UNESCO actually have a working committee about what should happen in Syria. They had some meetings about Aleppo, and I went to some of them, and it's one of the things which was a little bit shocking was that you realize that everyone wants to do something. So they had about 10 different committees. It became apparent there was about 10 different committees who were all trying to assess the degree of damage, and absolutely no cooperation, and no one who could actually represent Syria. You would have the different fractions of Syria saying, but you don't know what I know about the situation. And so it is actually shockingly difficult to do anything of any real help in a situation like that, because from outside you cannot interfere with the state, and you certainly cannot easily work with the different fractions within that country.
Can I say something about this? And I want to bring it back to an important point you made at the very end before turning to this question, is that heritage is very much a living thing, and your first point of it being very much a collective thing. So people have to agree on something for it to be considered under this category. And two, it's alive even when it's a building, right? So it's even all the more so when it's a living tradition, right? I mean, I deal with an oral tradition. I'm writing my book on a type of singing that people have been doing for the history of throughout the history of Christianity, with no form of writing music, only the texts have been written. So the more I study it, the more I realize of it's just like looking at the remains of a huge castle. So you see something that's fascinating, you think, I wonder how much more amazing what I don't see anymore was. And the minute you realize that what you're looking at is not this miniature structure, it was actually a very complex system that created a lot of beauty, and only bits of it were successfully passed down. You just stand and you think, you know, this is awesome. But then how to reconstruct that, how to rebuild that, how to understand it, how to figure it out, how to know what is existing now and what it means. So, and it's all happening because the people who are singing it are singing it. They're still living together, they're still living in that place. And so, unfortunately, when I started studying this particular church in Aleppo, not in my wildest dreams would I have thought that more than 90% of the community would be gone before my book has seen the light, right? So it's turning into a historical project, in a sense, when it was actually supposed to be a glimpse in an ongoing story where I would say this is a living community and this community has a future, and in the middle there's this huge slump. But actually the people are still alive. I mean, they don't any longer live in the same place together at the same time. So their tradition inevitably will sound different. Within 5 years will sound even more different within 10 years. But then this brings the question of responsibility and the livingness of it all. I mean, if we're talking about a living thing, then the lives of those who practice that thing is really at the heart of what's at stake. And the collective responsibility of recognizing heritage is also a collective responsibility of recognizing the people who practice that heritage and the circumstances and the ways in which they do so. So again, this is also a collective responsibility, and you know, this brings us to the diplomatic side of things. So it's all very interconnected, and somehow when from my perspective, I'm always thinking about this living, ongoing thing. You have to go to church to hear this music. It wouldn't survive if this church isn't the same place. I mean, it isn't there anymore. You'd have to take the same people and put them in a different place, and it's impossible.
Actually, just on that point, sorry to interrupt, but so the church in which this tradition arose, has that now been destroyed? Is it still there?
It's actually still there. What's interesting about this particular community is that it migrated after World War I because of because they conceived a danger to their existence. So they were living in a city that historically was called Edessa, and this is one of the oldest centers of Christianity. It's where the literary form of early Christianity began. And so those people can successfully trace their roots to the early Christians, as we know from texts and textual and historical evidence. And so they lived there on and off, in different mutations until World War I, where they perceived that they are under collective threat. So they struck a deal with this city, and they all together picked up and left. And this was a unique incident in the history of Christianity in southeastern Turkey, because all the other communities just spread. People had to flee for their lives, and this is the only instance where a whole town left and settled in another place. So for 100 years, they still sounded pretty much very, very similar to what they sounded like before, at the beginning of the 20th century, which nowhere else in southeast Turkey we can say about any of the Christian communities. And the more I study those communities, the more I realize there were centers of musical excellence. So I met this man, for instance, in the southeast of Turkey, and I can think of him now as an important doctor, like a Winchester trooper kind of person, right? It's the human beings are the sources there. And so the fact that they're dissipating now is the real loss, is the real disentanglement of this heritage.
Sorry,
So I'm sorry,
just briefly, so you said there that perhaps the tradition might not survive, certainly in its current form, if the building was destroyed. That implies a strong connection between the tradition of singing and the building itself. What do you think, how would you articulate that connection? What is that, how does that connection work, and the relationship, and how does one feed, how does the space, the building relate to and feed into the music and vice versa?
That is an excellent question, and I would love for some collaboration between musicians and architects for that to be figured out. This particular building I recorded in is not a historical building. It's a building they built after they came to the city. It's still standing because the neighborhood is still standing. Now, only 2 days ago, the neighborhood was under heavy bombardment. So, with that in mind, the real destruction, and this brings me to the question of heritage and responsibility and the livingness. The real destruction at this point, as I see it, is the fact that people can't live there anymore, and they're having to go everywhere. So even a single family I would have worked with a few years ago when I was doing field work there aren't living in the same place anymore. They're spread between Europe, the United States, Canada, who knows what. They're trying to find ways to survive and multiply that by multiple families. So there's that level, and then there's the building and the connection with that, which is incredibly interesting and definitely worth studying, but I don't know of any work done on it.
But it also implies a connection between the tangible and intangible.
Absolutely.
That the intangibles are also, in their own way, heavily reliant upon place and space and fabric.
I think that's a very common critique of the UNESCO's divisions, because a lot of intangible are very dependent on the instrument or the place, the setting, the particular ingredients and so on. The intangible doesn't exist just as abstract. And by creating that definition of two difference, it sort of kind of belies the very interesting interconnection. It's like the tangible also have a lot of its quality which are very intangible. So it's been a bit of a, but it's not particular to our topic here, but it is a quite recognized unfortunate consequence that we separate those out rather than embracing the connection and explores that.
Good. Now, all of you seem to have been involved in one form or another in sort of heritage-based projects, unlike myself. So maybe we should turn for a moment to a sort of more technical question, just for the information of the audience. So how would one go about establishing the heritage value or historical significance of a place, an event, an object, or what have you? And I guess this goes back a bit to the question of who decides, but presumably there must be some kind of technical procedure or mechanism for doing this, enacting this kind of process. What are these sort of processes?
There's usually a number of criteria whether it's UNESCO, they have a number of criteria that countries assess their potential heritage against, and it in some way comes out of, you referred earlier to 19th century, to all the conservation movement, where you have to assess, and there becomes through the years more and more formalized, so there will be criteria behind why part of St. John's is listed in that level and other parts of St. John's is only listed at a lower level. And it would have, originally just had to do with architectural representativity and beauty and skill, and increasingly it's also about social value. So for example, in England, if things are listed, amenity value is one of the criteria which it can score on. So there is a formal process which you usually have to go through for it to be legal binding. And the interesting thing is where that sits in relationship to people's own sense of, this is something we want to protect. This may not qualify through those criteria, but it's important to us. And you have in some country, like in Africa, there's a very strong traditional value, or in Australia, very strong traditional value, which have resulted in other kinds of things being protected as well, or attempt of connect sort of formal legal criteria with customary practices. But
well, so that just also raises the issue of, should we include here natural heritage? Because although we often look at pristine landscapes and describe them as natural heritage, oftentimes they are curated in some way which makes them artificial, human constructs. So they're kind of landscapes of the human imagination. And
under UNESCO, you also have natural heritage. So, but it's again that the problem in some way is that you have to compare and you select, and in that process something is said not to be significant all the time. And all the comparisons are against the same kind of criteria, so they become rather rigid in order to work like that.
I guess one of the problems is that something that's not considered significant now might be in the future, but it might be too late by the time they realise it is significant.
Yeah.
And here I think of my own field, Victorian architecture. For a long time, Victorian architecture was considered neither here nor there. It was people pushing down Victorian buildings left, right and centre. In fact, it was a famous phrase of Nicholas Pevsner, which was, what the Luftwaffe failed to destroy during the Second World War, the modern urban planners took care of. And so that gives you an insight into how these buildings were valued, because after all, by the time you get to the immediate post-war period, we're talking about buildings which may have only been 60, 70, 80 years old, and perhaps people didn't understand their significance. And so lots of them were demolished. It was not until the 1970s that people really began to wake up to what was going on. And a whole preservation movement around Victorian architecture rose up. The Victorian Society was formed, and from that moment on, Victorian buildings began to be listed. And a similar process is now also happening with modern architecture. There are these organisations like Docomomo who go around studying modern buildings and presenting them to be listed by heritage organisations, because what their argument is, well, some of these buildings may only be 20, 30, 40, 50 years old now, but if we don't look after them in the here and now, it may be too late by the time we realise we want to protect them. And to come back to the Victorian example, for instance, and one really telling building in this respect is St Pancras Station in London. That building came within a hair's breadth of being demolished in 1970. But now, as you can see, it's been lovingly and wonderfully restored. So we wouldn't dare think about demolishing it now. So this goes to show how attitudes change towards heritage. We realise it needs to be protected.
I think one of the challenges which we have experienced with ISIS and also slightly before is when the destruction is deliberate. It's not just decay. It's not that we have decided this is not valuable anymore. This is something was considered to have value and is deliberately destroyed. And I think there we are entering into a different kind of discourse, a different way of making heritage political that we are not very well armed to respond to. So it's all we all find it very horrible, and then you sort of wonder whether that was actually the intention. Anyway, so I think we are, in terms of what was part of probably motivation for this particular panel, we're also facing something which we are unfamiliar with. I think that if you look back to the Second World War, that was generally collateral damage. It wasn't that it was, we don't have so many examples of it being specifically targeted, or if it's targeted, earlier it was because it was being robbed. It wasn't to hurt someone. So,
well, I mean, arguably the Germans were pretty systematic. I mean, Rotterdam was bombed after the Netherlands had capitulated.
yeah, or the
British,
very
the British did the same to
destruction,
Dresden,
but they were not.
Well, that was revenge in wartime, but
But it was not
I'm not
picking
good-
out certain buildings. Because
Right, yeah.
that it was not like, if anything, St. Paul's was arguable, protected or not protected.
they just tried to get to Buckingham Palace.
Yeah, so,
apparently.
but,
Pity they didn't.
but that sense of how do you hurt people?
Right.
Yeah.
How do you hurt them best?
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is, having considered what heritage is, are we agreed that heritage is in fact in peril? And are we being perhaps a little bit alarmist, given that hasn't heritage always been in peril to some extent? And if so, what's different today in this current context? You mentioned ISIS as being a factor which we haven't really encountered before, or have we encountered such people? I think of the Puritans in
we saw
East
it in the
Anglia in the
bulk
16th century.
in the war, in the breakup of Yugoslavia. We saw also the ethnic harm. That sense of there was like 95% of the religious building was destroyed, and the bombing patterns were different. You could see that houses were bombed, but religious buildings was blown up from inside. So it was a very deliberate pattern. So we have seen it for a while, but whether we know it further back,
Well, the thing is,
so
it might be a
explicit.
shock to us today because in recent times we haven't really seen anything like this on such a systematic scale, or at least nothing has been reported in the social media in this way. And perhaps that's what brings it to our attention more than other events in the immediate past. But going back in time, we can think of examples like the Puritans in East Anglia in the 16th
Iconoclasm
century, Iconoclasm, going around
You can look at iconoclasm.
churches and deliberately destroying statues of religious imagery for religious purposes, very much like ISIS in fact.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think there are some people studying the extent to which they are the same, how much it's about censorship and how much it is about hurting, and whether iconoclasm had the same degree of deliberately hurting. And I think in that sense also the social media and the global world we live in makes it different, everyone here.
Yeah, and this reminds me of, was it Bruno Latour's 5 levels of iconoclasm, or 5 degrees of iconoclasm, one of which is this sort of cynical wanton destruction of heritage for the sake of it, deliberately just to offend a particular people or culture. It's one of these categories, whereas there are other categories which are more kind of benign or more focused on religious belief, but there is this category which is just malicious. I think ISIS is certainly...
I mean, the Taliban's destruction of these giant Buddha statues were taken, I think, as a kind of milestone or watershed in that very specific thing you're saying. So I wondering if I could throw a couple of other things in there for the discussion. One is that it's not just that heritage is in peril, but heritage can be a weapon also. I mean, that's what I've been studying in Jerusalem, and there's extensive literature on this, that you can choose to identify a particular layer of history. You can use science and expertise to sort of identify it, preserve it at the expense of other layers, and then you can make political arguments to legitimacy and these famous sort of facts on the ground and so on. And so it's not so much that we're indifferent to other people's heritage, or that someone else's heritage is not interesting to us, is that when someone else's heritage becomes exclusionary and denies our own identity or heritage, that's when, particularly in situations of this sort of ongoing conflict, when it's not wise or possible to engage in open warfare or violence, you carry on the violence by other means, which can be heritage practices. So that's something to also bear in mind. And also that there's heritage of conflict. Famously in Berlin, initially you sort of see an angry East German guy hammering away at the wall, in November in '89, and then the wall did disappear quite quickly. And then there was a sort of moment when tourists came and wanted to see the wall, and the wall wasn't really there anymore, and then that began to provoke local people to think about the wall and its value, the fact that, maybe my cousin died trying to cross it, maybe that's significant, maybe I want a piece of the wall to be there. And then subsequently there's been a heritage industry in Berlin of bringing back the wall in all sorts of very ambiguous ways, reconstructing it in certain places, and that's for the to commemorate this, and that's for art, and that's for, you know, that's Checkpoint Charlie.
There's a nice connection there between heritage and memorial.
Yeah.
That sort of connection.
Exactly. But these two things that people want, or, you know, going back to former Yugoslavia in Belgrade, when, you know, the war against, with NATO over Kosovo against Serbia, some of these buildings are still destroyed and demolished, and there's a, you know, very extensive debate about what should we do with these buildings. I mean, we need to keep them because they, you know, they're testament, they're witness. So we, you know, heritage as a historical witness, but also as witness of destruction. And so that to reconstruct it would be to deny someone's memories, for example.
It's like some of the Wren churches in London, which were left just as they were after the Great Fire, as a memorial to that event.
Again, going, yeah, has ancient roots as well.
I mean, I can't help but think about the heritage in peril and then heritage and then peril, right? So we are talking about heritage. Yes, heritage is tangible, whether it's tangible or intangible, however we want to define it or agree on. It's evolving, it's moving, and in that sense, it will never be the same. Does that mean it's going to perish, or does that mean it's going to develop? And so it seems to me that what prompted this panel are certain circumstances that are bringing to our attention certain heritage in a certain kind of peril. And those are probably the things that we sort of keep coming back to. We visit history, and then we come back to this moment and we say, well, actually, we really don't know what on earth is going on. We don't know how to deal with it. So this is probably where conversations like this can begin to think of solutions. And I continuously, I can't stop thinking about all these comparisons between what's going on now, as we're talking about it in terms of what we see in the news and ISIS and the Middle East and so on, and the historical examples. And one difference has struck me. I mean, I'm sure many of you know so many examples, especially in that region that has had so many empires, cultures, languages, civilizations, religions come and go and rotate. And there's particular buildings that have had multiple histories and multiple roots in history. And so, but it was interesting that so many churches versus church/temple/mosque would be the same building and would have been reinvented by the different people that came along. Whereas now you have this certain group that's going everywhere and blowing things up for no other. I mean, yes, they have converted one church, I think, in Mosul to a mosque, but otherwise it's systematic destruction. And I think I wonder what we could make of that and how we might be able to think about that in light of, you know, the purpose of this panel. And I don't know, maybe the audience.
Well, then I think it really raises this question of who are they trying to shock and hurt, and certainly local people, but it's really to display a certain ability to terrorize or upset at a global level when you can't send missiles there, or, you know, you can occasionally, you know, possibly incite somebody to some sort of act, but it's essentially not, they don't really care for those buildings enough to convert them to anything. It's not even out of religious sentiment. I mean, you know, there's a theory that ultimately ISIS is a kind of a Saddamite type of organization, and they spread terror in a very particular kind of way. Most of these people aren't especially radical necessarily. They use the ideology for certain, again, for global audiences, but actually they terrorize, and then one of the ways in which you can terrorize is to destroy, for example, World Heritage as a way of getting at everybody.
Also makes good propaganda for them as it spreads through social media.
It's cynical.
Just to stay with ISIS for a second, so, you know, we have this image of ISIS blowing up parts of Palmyra and other buildings of historic significance. And this makes for, I guess, good global headlines, sparking a sense of dread and horror and alarm. But what about less visible or less tangible factors such as neglect or indifference to the historic environment, either by governments or by individuals? How significant is that a threat to global heritage? In other words, ISIS might be a spectacular example of heritage destruction, but there are much longer running, drawn out forms of heritage destruction which we don't really notice perhaps that much.
Does that not come back to your point about it being alive? If heritage is alive, of course, it would always also be in process of falling apart and being neglected and so on as attention shift to other things. So that may be a natural part of it, and what we are concerned about is something where actually decisions are made about destroying it. If people don't care for it, that is probably within their rights. So I don't know if we need to be concerned about that, because that happens all the time, everywhere. And we are maybe, we are single something out that we would care for, and the rest of it will disappear or be rebuilt or reused in various ways until someone else decides, oh, I actually wanted to care for it. So I thought maybe that is a part of simple how life is, how we function in the world, because otherwise heritage becomes something which stops us. And we cannot get on. It's just if everything had to freeze up.
I think the reason I raised this question is because I can think of one example in particular, which is Hong Kong. Now, as you all know, Hong Kong was a British colony from 1842, and it was once a wonderful historic environment. But over the years, owing to pressures of property development, capitalism, that environment was systematically and slowly erased for much more modern, high-rise apartments and office buildings, to the point where there was almost nothing left. We're talking a handful of buildings. Only then did they wake up to the fact that, oh, look, what have we done? Hong Kong people started to see themselves as Hong Kongers as opposed to people from Britain or people from China. And they wanted they wanted their urban environment to speak to that unique identity separate from China and separate from Britain, yet there was almost nothing left. It was too late. So that's, you might call this a form of initial indifference, which then turned into a kind of alarm once they realised that it was sort of... And I see this happening in modern day China as well. I remember going to Guangzhou in the late 90s, seeing these amazing Chinese domestic settings, these streets, these gated streets built in the 15th century. Amazing antique Chinese architecture. These streets had these gates at either end. The gates were closed at night, and these wonderful Chinese arches, and really beautiful. But literally, as I was there, these are being pushed over to make way for really ugly, nondescript modern apartment buildings. This is heritage lost forever. I mean, this is happening all the time in China.
This reminds me of when musicologists go into a community and then they record things and then they say, this is it, you have to learn this. And so, and I, so many of us think, well, who am I to tell people what they should keep and what they should let go of, right? So there is a natural process of people making choices. So I just wanted to throw this out there, but I also wanted to mention that there should be, and I know that multiple UNESCO initiatives try to do that, this engagement with the local communities is to create a conversation between the experts and the people who own this heritage on multiple levels. The other thing I was struck by are simply so many buildings in this country where there aren't funds to rehabilitate them or to restore them, and you hear about one project at a time, and you think, well, there's a lot that the world is missing out on preserving that it would like to preserve just because money is not available for this kind of thing. So this is not intentional. This is not. This might be happening, but it's the course of thinking about things as we think differently is changing. How do we create the resources for that is perhaps another level of thinking about different forms of peril.
I mean, the trouble is that when funds are being made available, or when values are being recognized and so on, there's, in the current literature, also a lot of critique of two processes. One is sort of museumification and commodification. That, once people sort of gather, all right, it's possibly valuable, also possibly profitable, you start to displace communities potentially, or treat the buildings in certain ways, or even privileged and tangible things in certain ways that will ultimately, fundamentally work against the interests and the livingness of that particular locality. So it's sort of between the sort of this intentional ideological modernist disregard for the existing, because it just has no value if you move forward because you're interested in economic transformation and so on, to, oh, this is valuable, but then we really struggle to find ways of preserving in meaningful ways.
Well, understanding it as cultural capital, it could have an economic dimension as well, if only used
Yeah.
in a particular way. But what about, I also think, when I think about heritage in peril, I also think about other slower forms of destruction, like the contraband antiques market, where people go around chipping bits and pieces off temples slowly but surely over the years until there's nothing left. This is also a problem, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's a big problem, and there's a lot of international initiative around that. But you know, one can think about it just in terms of the police and undercover this and undercover that. We had one recently from some people from campus involved in exposing someone in London. But one can also take it more, a little bit more political abstractly and think about, again, like who has the right. So there's a very, very big criminal aspect of it, where the people who do it don't have any right. But there are also a lot of local people who actually, they are
Feed
even
their families.
do it to keep their family sort of fed. So it's a little bit easy sometimes to sit in London and say it's all very, very wrong. At the same time as the people who do it maybe in the end will lose out, because a heritage which could have been used as a different kind of a source is gone. But the legal structure for it exists and is used. More and more countries are signing up for it, and it's developing. And in China, you even have the death penalty for illicit trafficking. But it's sad to be next to the narcotics trade in terms of the money being moved around.
And apparently this is what ISIS were also doing, not just destroying things, but actually
Yes.
chipping them off.
Yeah, preserving.
Yes.
Good heritage practitioners.
I think that
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
it's a little bit, there was a while that was put out in the newspaper as really big. It's a little bit being questioned now exactly how much they do and how much is actually the existing illicit traffic, which people are connecting with ISIS, and it happened anyways. But there certainly is something they also benefit from.
But I mean, I've been sort of party to conversations, unfortunately, where people sort of said, well, in the 50s and 60s, if you went to places like the Louvre or the, which is now the Musée de Branly, you could sort of bribe a porter, give him $5,000, and they would give you some priceless, small, but still, it was quite, sort of a gentleman's agreement type.
But we will certainly
in our sort of, Western.
We'll certainly tell you that whether or not you see it at the market when you go out traveling as tourists, do not buy it. It is illegal and it's wrong and it's harmful somewhere to someone.
Just before I open this discussion to the floor, perhaps one final question here about the actual organisations that are involved in creating heritage parameters, I suppose, and sort of policing it in a way, like UNESCO, or in this country, organisations like the National Trust, Historic England, Historic Scotland, and so on. I guess these organisations do a lot of good, and we value their presence, but they also bring problems of their own. I think of UNESCO, for instance. I come from Edinburgh, which is a UNESCO World Heritage City, and I often hear people complaining about UNESCO and how it's almost as if the city has been ossified. You can't develop it without the say-so of UNESCO, and people are now saying, who are these people? What right have they got to tell us that we can't do this or that? So in the end, although they valued initially this being given this accolade of a UNESCO World City, they've come to a certain extent to regret it. And Liverpool went through the same process. It was a UNESCO World Heritage City. It lost its status, and they thought, great, it's actually taken a millstone from around down there.
Yeah.
So I guess it's not all good, and I think these organisations can bring problems with them as well, right?
I think they're testimonies to a very peculiar kind of civic, secular religion. I mean, there's a sort of correlation apparently between people leaving the Anglican Church and people joining the Landmark Trust, and so there's a genuine or English heritage. You sort of you stop praying so that because your children are already in the right school, and then you go to English heritage. And it's a peculiar kind of worshipping and.
I think it's interesting where one places the critique, because this thing about that how much they interfere with the place after it's got its status, I actually think they interfere much less than we think they do. It's more that a local bureaucracy develop and explain itself by UNESCO wanting this and UNESCO wanting that. a little bit like the EU, actually. So that I think for that bit, the UNESCO is not necessarily to blame. I think, if anything, one feel a bit betrayed by how little attention they give to places, particularly in the third world, which I think thought they were going to get a lot of tourists and a lot of money, and instead of that, they got this site they have to look after, and they have no means of doing it. So UNESCO is problematic in many ways, but I think it might be at not so much at the practical. It's I think it's more about creating a particular kind of values and assumptions of the world, of the global, which should be much more
a kind of ethos or something.
Yeah.
I wonder whether there can be, in such an interconnected world, in such a cheaply connected world, I wonder whether new ways can be thought of to connect formal ways or highly formalized forms of preservation or safeguarding or other initiatives that UNESCO and other places have taken, to connecting that with what people who actually live, where the life side of those monuments or heritage points or traditions are, and so maybe creating less of a formal gap. I don't know.
That is supposed to be happening now, so you won't get your status unless you have a plan for that.
But it still has to go through a highly formalized structural procedure that many countries that can't even afford, or many places or small traditions
you get a lot of consultants
right.
there.
Right.
They're doing that, yeah.
So do you think this is the direction of travel for the 21st century for heritage, this sort of connection between status and having a plan, as opposed to just having a status bestowed upon you and then leaving it to yourself to...
They're definitely keen on action plans, and also buffer zones and so on, that you not just sort of put a circle around a particular place, but then you also draw a second circle and so on, and think of how the place might integrate and so on, which creates other problems, but they're definitely... I think Ecomos as well is probably more...
I think they're
free.
worse.
They're
terrible.
What about proxy ways?
No, fair enough. I'm not an ambassador to that.
What about forms of supporting by proxy? So, for instance, if you can, if you know that a certain group of people who maintain a certain tradition, I'm sorry, I keep going to the living side. This is where my mind is programmed. So whether there are ways of supporting people to keep doing what they're doing, which would be, a natural result of which would be that they will continue to do this precious tradition we're thinking about.
That's what the intangible heritage is about. If you get declared as intangible heritage, you're supposed to be supported and helped to be able to maintain those traditions and for next generation to learn and participate in practice. So I think the ideas are there, just that in practice
very complicated.
It's more complicated,
I mean, I don't really know, but when you're bestowed this status by UNESCO or some such organisation, does funding come with that, or is it just expected that the government will then fork up the money?
It doesn't come with funding, and I think I've been involved in a case in Cape Verde where I work in west of Africa, and I'm sure they thought they would come with funding. So it doesn't come with any funding. They can get some advice. They can come advisor coming out once or twice a year if they need to.
Do you think maybe it should, that the UN should get its act together and actually say to, especially places, I mean, it should be obviously it's a horses for courses thing. If certain countries or locations obviously cannot afford to have a sustainable form of heritage preservation, that the UN then kicks in some money to get it going, or get a plan in action sort of thing? Is that?
I think maybe it's a little bit difficult to pick it apart like that, as if there's just one issue. I think there are quite a lot of interconnected issues which are a little bit complicated, or rather complicated, and it's like we've got ourselves in a situation where the concept has become a branding. So, for example, China is very, very keen to get World Heritage sites. We don't really particularly want them anymore because we're arrogant and we don't think we gain anything particular from it. But it has got a certain value in the world. And so it's not so easy to go in and say, no, we don't want to have this anymore. It's a burden on local community it robs them of their autonomy in terms of thinking about their heritage and so on. So maybe money will help, but who will pay for this? You know, UNESCO is not a wealthy organization by any means, and very easily you could just have the members will drop off if they have to pay more.
But it's part of the UN, right? Is it?
Yeah.
But if there's no avenue there, they could exploit.
And maybe
They're not awash with cash.
they're not awash with cash.
And if you go to UNESCO in Paris, they have a little sort of the little square in front of their building is kind of dilapidated and so on, and they're sort of talking about doing something about it, but it's quite costly. It's like they're just about pulling it together for themselves.
And you have to find the cheapest hotel if they have to. So, no, but I think much more have to happen at the national level. So to let UNESCO happen, but don't think that UNESCO will solve our national problems. Maybe.